My name is Winston Taki. I'm the Director of Communications for Rewire to Build Africa. And I would like to say good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to all of us who are joining us from across the world. First of all, I'd like to say distinguished guests, speakers, partners, and friends, you are warmly welcome to today's webinar. And thank you for joining us from wherever you are across the world. We want to acknowledge you. This is a webinar organized by Rewire to Build Africa. And we are speaking on the topic, the G7, G20, and Africa, redefining global partnerships for climate health and sustainable growth. And I would like you to know that Rewire to Build Africa is a research and policy think tank and advisory firm. We are actually committed to advancing sustainable, evidence-based solutions for Africa's most pressing development challenges. And we promise you today's engagement is going to be insightful. We will be hearing from John Keckton, a Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Privileged to also be joined by Octavio Canuto, the Senior Fellow for the Policy Center for the New South. And certainly hear from Dennis Maplazi, the health equity advocate and patient experience leader. And so today is going to be a full package for us. Before we commence officially to formally open the program, it's my honor to invite Michelle Adirayi. He's the Director of Research and Policy at Rewire to Build Africa. So Michelle, please take over.
Okay. Thank you very much, Winston. It's really an honor to have our esteemed guest here. So on behalf of Rewire to Build, I'm very delighted to welcome all of you to today's webinar. At Rewire to Build, we are driven by a very simple but urgent question. So basically, we are looking at how to design global systems so that these global systems can work better for people, for the planet, and for the future. Now, Africa sits at a very interesting intersection in terms of the world's global pressing challenges. Challenges like climate vulnerability, health inequality, and development financing gap. Africa is kind of challenged with these issues. But interestingly, we are also an area where there's immense opportunity and innovation and resilience. So the way we look at global partnerships as Africa is quite interesting. Is it just we being beneficiaries of these global agendas or being true co-architects of these solutions? I believe that G7 and G20, they remain like very powerful tools or powerful platforms that actually shape these global priorities that we are looking at. Today's discussion actually brings together different perspectives across global governance, development, and health equity. It brings perspective that would make us understand Africa's role when it comes to the G7 and the G20. And we're actually honored to be joined by three international individuals who give us very unique perspective on how these global partnerships actually are designed to benefit the globe and Africa. So I would like to thank all of you for making time to join us today. And I'm hopeful that this is going to be a session that would bring us insightful policies, insightful engaging, and practical action. So at the end, whatever we actually discuss would be fruitful for the continent. Thank you very much. And I'll hand over to Winston.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for giving us this brief insights on Rewire to Build Africa. So without much ado, I would like to begin our first presentation, which will be delivered by Professor Keckton, John Keckton. He's a Professor Emeritus of Political Science, University of Toronto, a very respected voice in his field, who will be sharing key insight with us this afternoon, morning, or wherever you are, depending on the time frame you find yourself in. And before he begins, I would like to acknowledge the presence of Dennis, who just joined us. Dennis, it's good to have you join us at the moment. Dennis
Thank you.
Mapazi.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I would like to once again acknowledge Professor John Curtin, who actually joined very early. Prof, the floor is yours, and the audience also awaits your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bienvenue. Welcome, everyone. How can G7 and G20 summit diplomacy translate their work into tangible outcomes for Africa, for health, for climate change, and economic growth? To answer, we must first see what G7 and G20 summits have done on these priorities in the past, then consider what they can do this year under Emmanuel Macron's G7 summit in June and Donald Trump's G20 summit in December. First, the G7. Since their start at Rambouillet, France in 1975, G7 summits have become the center of global governance in the economic, ecological, social, and security domains. For 51 years, over half a century, their annual summits have had perfect attendance, always attracting all the leaders of all their 8 members: the United States, Japan, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, Canada, and the European Union. African leaders started coming as invited guests at Italy's Genoa summit in 2001 as the new millennium began. Then to Canada's the year after in 2002, and to almost every G7 summit since. At Canada's Kananaskis summit last year in June 2025, South African President Ramaphosa participated with all G7 leaders just after Donald Trump had left. G7 leaders started making collective commitments on Africa at Bonn, Germany in 1985, 40 years ago. They had made 481 commitments on Africa by their 50th summit in Apulia, Italy in 2024. From 1985 to Hiroshima in 2023, these African commitments were led by those on development with 131, then food and agriculture, 55, regional security, 53, and health, 48. On the economy, trade had 18, digitalization, 21, and macroeconomic policy, 1. On the ecology, however, climate change had only 2, and the other environmental issues, only 2. And on partnerships, international cooperation had only 4. So much to do there. Members' compliance with these 481 African commitments averaged 76%, just below the G7's overall compliance on subjects of 78%. My group focuses on compliance. We're all used to our political leaders, home and abroad, making promises, but do they keep them when they go back home or after they are made? Still, we must note that last year at the Kananaskis Summit in Canada in June, G7 leaders made no commitments on Africa among the 147 they made overall. But still, with that gap G7 summits have worked for Africa, but more for Africa rather than with Africa and Africans so far. Now, has the bigger, broader G20 done better? Over to Dennis to answer that.
Thanks, John. The G20 summits have worked for Africa too. Since their start in Washington, D.C. in November of 2008, one African country, this is South Africa, was a full member from the start. The African Union joined as a full member in 2024. From the start, the leaders of the World Bank and the IMF were full members. The UN Secretary General came as a guest. Nigeria was selected as a member of the finance ministers level at the start in 1999, but has never come. From 2008 to 2024, the G20 summit made about 117 commitments on Africa. They started in London in April of 2009 and continued at every summit since. The peak came in Hamburg, Germany in 2017 with 55 commitments, followed by Osaka in 2019 with 7. From 2008 to 2024, G20 summits made 117 commitments on Africa. They started at London in April 2009 and continued every summit since. The peak came at, I'm repeating. These African commitments were led by those on developments with 57, followed by health with 9, gender equality 7, and labor employment 6. Microeconomics, policy, and trade had 5 each. Climate change, energy, food, agriculture, and migration refugees had only 4 each. And now to the G20 Johannesburg. The most recent G20 summit held in Johannesburg, South Africa, November 22 to 23 last year, did much for and with Africa. It was the first one held in Africa and the first one boycotted by the US President Donald Trump and the US government as a whole. But all the other members participated. They produced a substantial performance overall. Johannesburg ranked the 11th amongst the other 20 regular G20 summits so far and shares the average B-level performance for all the previous 19 we've had. Despite Donald Trump's government's boycott, all other 20-member governments issued consensus declaration. For the first time, they did so at the start of the summit, the first day. To be sure, only 67% of the G20 members sent their leaders, the lowest portion ever. But the 20-member government present participating, including the European Union and now the African Union, produced a declaration of almost 11,000 words, close to the average of a previous summits. It contained 195 commitments above the G20's overall average of 171. And Trump ended his government's complete boycott by agreeing to have the presidency handover ceremony from South Africa to the US for 2026 took place if at a junior foreign ministry level and well after the summit had ended. Moreover, the G20 future was agreed by all, with its presidency going to the United Kingdom in 2027 and Korea in 2028. Thus, at Johannesburg, the G20 faced its most severe stress test, survived it, and thrived. A closer look at the 6 key dimensions of summit governance confirms this substantial performance. On the first dimension, the domestic political management, the leaders' attendance was unprecedentedly small. It had the first full boycott by a member and its entire government coming from the United States, the most powerful member and a member of the G20 governing troika, as its presidency in 2026. Indeed, the US plans for its 2026 summit has already been made public, very early and unusual detail. This US boycott led directly to the absence of Argentina's president, Javier Milei, who was highly ideological, aligned with Trump. Also missing was Russian President Vladimir Putin, Chinese President Xi Jinping, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, at the very last minute, the Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto. So 7 leaders skipped the summit. However, the summit's domestic political approval in media was very strong, especially in the host country in South Africa, in Africa, and the global South. On the second dimension of deliberation, its public performance was strong. In the summit's most memorable moment, the South African presidency issued its declaration on the very start of the summit, despite Trump's opposition to issuing any declaration at all. The declaration's content was solid. Its 10,940 words were close to 19 previous summits. Overall average of its just 12,000 words. It was also a significant expansion of the second draft of the Johannesburg Declaration, which had only 7,770 words. However, in the private deliberation among leaders, performance was small. For the first time, the first of the 3 sessions of the summit were live streamed, often including the audio of the leaders' speeches. And since so many non-leaders gave such speeches, the session resembled the opening of the United Nations General Assembly far more than the normal G7 and the G20 summits before. On the third dimension, principled normative direction setting, performance was significant. On the G20's 2 distinctive foundational missions of preserving financial stability and making globalization work for all, performance on the latter was very strong. This was due to the emphasis on the development, equality, and inclusiveness throughout. On the fourth dimension, decision-making, performance was significant. The declaration of 195 commitments were all above the G20 summit's overall of 171 and above the number in the second version of the draft declaration, which had only 136. However, 70% of Johannesburg's commitments were weak and unambitious. Members largely promised to continue doing what they have been doing before, and as much as before, rather than doing new things and more. The declaration's 195 commitments were led by those on development with 19, and crime and corruption with 18. Food security had 14, gender equality and culture and tourism, 13 each. Climate change and the digital economy had 10 each. Health and energy had 9 each. Then with 8 each came the disasters and microeconomics, financial regulation, trade and investments, and education. Next came critical minerals, the environment and regional security with 6. The commitments thus dominated by development and related priorities of South Africa, Africa, and the global South. Those as the hard economic core of this earliest summits hosted in US and global North appeared only with the commitments on microeconomic policy, financial regulation and trade, and investment in the 12th place. Standing out were the 6 commitments on regional security, with almost all of them strong, addressing the wars on Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, and elsewhere. There were 21 commitments explicitly on Africa or the countries and institutions therewithin, for 26% of the 195 overall, but only 4 of the 21 Africa commitments, or 19%, were ambitious, while 30% of 195 were. The only ambitious commitments of Africa were the 2 from regional security and the 1 each from financial regulation and crime corruption. The 21 Africa commitments were led by development and group food agriculture, 6 each, followed by digitization with 4, including AI with 3, regional security with 2, on Sudan and Democratic Republic and Congo, and environmental disasters, crime, corruption, and financial regulation with one each. There were none on health and climate change. On the fifth dimension, the delivery of these decisions before the next summit performance will likely be small. The United States has historically low compliance of only 27% with the priority commitments from previous summits, with Trump as president for most of the time. Very few Johannesburg commitments contained obligations to monitor and report implementation. And absent Trump priorities were largely absent too. However, members' overall compliance with the 2024 Rio commitments averaged 70%, closer to the G20's overall average of 71%. So, in 2026, all the members could again do more to compensate for the US doing far less. On the sixth dimension, the institutional development of global governance outside G20 performance was substantial. This was despite Trump's dislike of South Africa's membership in G20 itself and US membership and support for most multilateral organizations. The Johannesburg commitments contained 5 references to international organizations outside the G20. The UN got 2, Tendai Framework and 2030 Agenda, and the UNFCCC 1 each. There were 12 references to international institutions inside the G20. Inside the G20 performance was strong, but identifying the G20 presidency for the next 3 years, the US in 2026, the UK in 2027, and Korea in 28. The Johannesburg leaders ensured that the G20 and its summits would continue until Trump was no longer US president. The declaration also made several approving references to and commitments on other G20 institutions, platforms, and principles. Outside the G20 performance was small. The leaders' declaration contained references to supporting bodies such as the World Trade Organization and the World Health Organization, but there were very few commitments referring to them and none to increase their funding to replace the money that Trump had cut. On the key subject of health, G7 summit performance had been significant. It has been strong on the subjects Africans care about most, HIV/AIDS, especially with the creation of the Global Fund at the G7's Genoa Summit in 2001, and the Maternal, Newborn, and Child Health Canada's Muskoka Summit in 2010. At the highest focus, Kanaskis Summit in 2025, G7 leaders did make one commitment related to health. Among its 149 overall, it linked climate change to health in commitment noting how wildfires harmed human health. Trump fully agreed with all the 149. The G20 performance on health has been modest from 2008 to 2024. Health averaged 9% of the world in the declaration, including a surge to 21% from 2020 to 2024 due to COVID-19. Leaders made 177 health commitments for 13th place among all subject members. Compliance averaged 70%, and the G20 health governance really began with the Big Bang in Brisbane Summit in 2014. In response to the shock of Ebola outbreak in West Africa, half a world away, their leaders made 33 health commitments compared to none before. At Rome in 2012, they made 35 due to the shock of COVID. This declined to 17 in 2022, in 25, and 2023, 11 commitments, and 2024. At Johannesburg in 2025, leaders made only 9 health commitments. 6 of the 9 were pandemics, while only 3 were on the general health, including financing universal health coverage. 6 of the health commitments were weak and ambitious ones, which only 3 were strong ones, where leaders promised to do more than before on their own. There was only 1 link to health in the commitments on other subjects. There were no health links to many of the commitments on development disasters, climate change, and digital technologies, such as artificial intelligence. So silos, not synergies, prevailed. However, the Johannesburg Summit helped mobilize money for African health. It inspired the Replenishment Summit for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, held the day before the same city. That summit raised about $11 billion of its own $14 billion goal. Donald Trump's US contributed $4.6 billion, the largest sum by far of any member. As the Global Fund is dedicated first to ending HIV/AIDS, as this infectious diseases is the largest killer of Southern Africans, Trump's money did much for Africa, even if his presence and his proclamations did not. I will pass it over now to my colleague, Dr. Kurt. You're mute, John, you're mute.
Okay, on climate change, G7 summits invented the global governance of climate change at their Tokyo summit in 1979. They started making commitments on climate change at Bonn in 1985. And from then until 2024, their leaders made about 500 commitments on climate change. And they complied with them at a level of 77%, equal to their average compliance on all subjects, also at 77%. Last year at Kananaskis, June 2025, they made 21 commitments on climate change, all of them on the burning issue of wildfires ravaging, Los Angeles in Donald Trump's United States. And by December 28th last year, compliance with those commitments was already at 77%, above the overall average on all subjects then of 75%. What about the G20? G20 leaders started making commitments on climate change at their second summit in the United Kingdom in 2009. And from them until 2024, they made 180 commitments on climate change. And their members complied with them at 73%, just above the G20's all-subject average of 71%. And at Johannesburg in 2025, G20 leaders made 18 commitments on climate change for 9% of their 195 commitments overall. So both the G7 and the G20 summits really do work well, if not well enough, on climate change. On the economy, sustainable growth, G20 summits since 1975 made 339 commitments on macroeconomic policy, 487 on trade investment, and most importantly, 805 on development, which of course is what those in the global south equate with economic development. G7 summits made the most commitments on any subject on development. Development comes first at the G7 summits. Their compliance with their macroeconomic policy commitments averaged 84%, well above their all-subject average of 77%. And their compliance with their trade investment commitments, trade and investment much on everybody's minds these days, averaged 69%, and on development, 75%. However, at Kananaskis last year, the leaders made no commitments on macroeconomic policy, only 7 on trade, but they did make 13 on development. So the G7 summit got Donald Trump to make commitments on and for development, despite his attitudes when he's home alone in Washington, D.C., or Mar-a-Lago to the south. What about the G20? The economy was the focus of G20 governance since the start. And from their first summits through to 2024, they made 530 commitments on macroeconomic policy, another 116 on taxation, another 325 on financial regulation, 213 on trade investment, and 176 on international financial institutional reform. And compliance with their macroeconomic policy commitments, 81% on financial regulation, 67%, IFI reform, 69%, taxation, 75%. On development itself, the priority of the Global South, G20 summits since the start made 415 commitments with compliance of 68%. And at Johannesburg last year, the G20 leaders made 27 commitments on the economy, macroeconomic policy, financial regulation, and trade investment, each had 8, taxation 3. Development had 19 commitments. So if you add the economy and development total, it comes to 47, almost 1/3 of all the commitments made there. What about this year when we have Emmanuel Macron hosting the G7 summit in June, and then Donald Trump, the G21 in December. In the G7, President Macron has always reaffirmed his initial priorities. There's 8 of them. In the top tier are global macroeconomic imbalances. But in second, new partnerships for development finance. And third, critical minerals supply chain resilience. And in the second tier, resolving global geopolitical crises, notably through support for Ukraine. Fifth, protecting children through development aid and countering online assaults. 6, countering organized crime and illicit flows. 7, new roles for global governance. And 8, dialogue with major emerging countries. We don't have any specifically on Africa, on health, or climate change. Still, development comes second and critical minerals third, both of direct relevance to Africa. And critical minerals are critical for the renewable energies that control climate change. And there's a reason to believe that health will benefit from protecting children from online assaults, from organized crime dealing deadly illicit drugs such as opioids and cocaine, and from new rules for global governance, especially now that Donald Trump has withdrawn the United States from the World Health Organization. But at the G20, with Donald Trump in the chair, things don't look as hopeful. He assumed the G20 presidency for 2026 on December 1st, 2025, and he immediately went to work to transform it to make it work for America first. His quotes, not mine. He banished South Africa from the first preparatory meeting on December 15th to 16th in Washington. He said he would not invite President Ramaphosa to his G20 summit in Miami on December 13th, 14th. And he said South Africa should be expelled from the G20 for good. He reaffirmed the priorities he had set months before what he called a streamlined, stripped down back to basics summit, focused on the three priorities of the economy, energy, and technology. He said, more specifically, his summit would, quote, focus on unleashing economic prosperity by eliminations of the burdensome regulations, unlocking affordability, energy, and pioneering new technologies. And he went on to identify the energy grid, oil production, construction, blue-collar wages, tariffs, and incoming foreign direct investment into the United States. So none of our three big subjects on the list until we get to the economy, and it's really the American economy and not much attention to anybody else. But I think there are still possibilities for progress as 2026 unfolds. First, the United Kingdom's Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer is already a member of the G20's governing troika of past, present, and future presidencies because he's hosting it in 2027. And he could and has great reasons to bring South Africa and South Africa's priorities back as soon as possible. Miami's participants are likely to include the head of the African Union, which will represent an absent South Africa's interests and priorities. And Trump could also invite as some of his guests the individual African leaders he likes, such as those from, the Congo, Rwanda, Botswana, Zambia, Kenya, and Egypt at the moment. But who knows when he'll change his mind. On health, there's unlikely to be a health ministers meeting at the G20 level. But if there is, it would be designed and chaired by Trump's vaccine skeptic health minister, Robert F. Kennedy, with his focus on food. But for Trump himself, opioids and other deadly drugs are a priority. And Trump thinks they come into the United States to kill Americans from G20 members China, Canada, and Mexico. And measles has erupted in the United States, in states which are a key part of Trump's base. And the United States is in danger of losing its measles-free status. Trump's also concerned about prescription drugs and pharmaceuticals. He wants lower prices and more production at home. He worries about Chinese competition in this industry and how China is increasingly challenging US and European dominance in the drug discovery and production field. And the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, and increasingly used by Americans, expired in December, resulting in surging prices for medical care, thus providing more political pressure for Trump to act. And a new COVID-like shock could come at any time. Trump does have as one of his three priorities technology with artificial intelligence at the core. And AI could be made to work both for health and for climate change. So the challenge for those who want to make this year's G7 and G20 summits work for Africa, for health, and for climate change, as well as for economic prosperity, is to find ways to broaden the existing agendas and processes to advance that goal. And we look forward to your thoughts on how this can be done. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Professor John Ketten, and also Dennis, for giving us such a refreshing insight on G20 development and commitment. Certainly, key highlight, we know there are several commitments that has not been advanced, and there are still compliance-related challenges concerning key countries, G20. We know Donald Trump's decision has been an affront to many commitments in Africa, and thank you for that amazing insight, Prof. and Dennis. We really appreciate. But before we get Mr. Octavio in, and I would like to pick some questions from our guests who are also joining us at the moment. So if you have any question for Prof. and Dennis, and we are picking it live, you can type your questions also at the comment section or chat session, and we'll commit ourselves to read it out and get responses. And if you also want to speak, you can also raise your hand, and we'll give you the opportunity to ask your question or so. I think we have Scholastica Akalibe, who is also asking this question. It says, please, what is the criteria for a country to be a member of the G20, and why is South Africa the only member from Africa ever since 1975? This is from Akali Bay, who also you tell us where you are typing from, and also you asked us this question. So I think, Prof, can we get that response on the why is South Africa the only country in the G20? And yeah, basically yes. So, Prof, can you handle that question for us? Prof, can you hear us? Okay. Dennis, can you hear us?
Yeah, yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so we have one Akalibe who is asking, what is the criteria for a country to be a member of the G20, and why is South Africa the only member from Africa since 1975?
So I think the best person to be able to answer the question will be John. But from my presentation, what was happening is that South Africa has been there from the beginning. It's one of the founders. It's been there from the beginning. And Nigeria was also there, was also invited, but they didn't attend. So from looking at the reasons why South Africa is joining, and why other Africans are not joining, from my experience and having joined in December, having attended the G20, I found that South Africa was representing a lot of African countries in attending. So for the likes of, we had Namibia, we had Zimbabwe, we had Ethiopia attendance. And in doing so, they were able to bring voices for all the other African countries that had attended. And so I find that South Africa's voice into the G20 has been useful in advocating for
Yes.
many African countries. But that's just my opinion. John, are you ready to be able to answer the question?
I am. Can you hear me?
Okay,
Yes.
Octavio, before you come, let John pick it up, then I'll come to you, please. Thank you.
It's on this question. It's
very
on
quick.
South Africa. Go ahead.
John, go ahead.
Yeah. The G20 is the only international institution of relevance and reach that a Canadian conceived of and co-invented. It was Canada's finance minister, then later becoming a prime minister, Paul Martin. And he sat down with his U.S. counterpart, Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, in Washington on April 24th, 1999. And they said, who should be a member? The criteria was a brand new one: systemically significant states. And from the start, South Africa was always on the list. No debate at all about it. That was at the moment because of Trevor Emanuel, their finance minister, who was by far the most respected finance minister, participating at the heart of the global economy's governance in the IMF. And very quickly, they were ensconced in the need to, at the leaders level, cope with financial crises. And South Africa is one of the few G20 members that never caused a financial crisis. The United States did, the British did, the Europeans did. So South Africa was one of the countries that rode to the rescue of, all the former colonial powers when the European financial crisis erupted, but didn't go global, thanks to, the G20 leaders at their summit in Las Cabas, Mexico. So one could go on, but
Thank you,
due disclosure, the late Nelson Mandela was a Canadian citizen. We were the first country in the world to make him a citizen beyond South Africa. So that's both a reason why Paul Martin and Paul Martin's Canada has long seen South Africa as one of us.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Prof, for this insight. Before I take some more questions, I would like to give the platform to our very own Mr. Octavio.
Yes.
He has been with us, and I think we've had previous session with him here on Rewire to Build webinar. So, Mr. Octavio, this is your audience. They are ready for your presentation.
Okay, great. I will not try to be short, given that we already have begun. But I'm going to start with this question about why South Africa, okay? And I can claim that I have acquaintance because I was vice minister, deputy minister for international affairs at the Brazil's Ministry of Finance at the time of the transition and so on. I had even the honor of being invited by McCartney when he was at the Bank of Canada because he wanted to strengthen the liaison among the middle powers. So the expression that he highlighted so much in Davos something that has been akin with him. I am a testimony of that since the beginning of the 2000s. Okay. The G20 started as the agglomeration, the grouping of ministers of finance and central bank governors, period. It was only upgraded to the level of heads of states at the time of the global financial crisis. And at the time that the G20 was created, I participated in many meetings. It was, I can say, speaking bluntly, a mechanism of the G7 teaching the non-G7 countries on how to do banking, financial regulation, and how to behave macroeconomically. That was the spirit of the G20, period. I am a testimony. I was there watching the meetings. Because, in fact, the idea of calling in non-G7 countries came after the Asian financial crisis, the Russian crisis, and the LTCM downfall. It became clear for the G7 countries that they would, whatever happened with emerging markets was not something that the G7 could ignore because it backpacked. Period. G20 was created to be a forum of education of non-G7 countries. When we had the global financial crisis, originated in the US and obviously followed soon by two Eurozone crises, it became clear that so it had to be beyond simply educating the emerging markets. And the fact is that at the time that the G20 of ministers of finance and central bank governors was created, South Africa was the country that might have more implications to the G7 countries in Africa. Nigeria was not there yet. Nigeria is big, it's large, and but in terms of it's not by chance that when it came the time of BRICS, it was South Africa that was invited from Africa. It's a matter of size. It's not of and things evolve. Now you have other countries in Africa that have acquired size enough to question the position, but the reality is this: it's because South Africa was the country that might make an impact on the G7 countries. Okay, that's why South Africa was, and I'm a testimony. I was there. A bit briefly, I came to I started working in multilateral institutions 25 years ago, and I was a vice president and also executive director at the World Bank twice. I was also an executive director at the IMF, and I was also a vice president at the Inter-American Development Bank. I'm 70 years old. I already have time to, and now I'm a retiree from those institutions. Well, I saw exactly, accompanying the evolution of the relationship. Well, obviously, Africa, as the vice president of the World Bank, responsible for some departments. One of the departments was the trade department. I benefited from the studies done by the bank team, highlighting the fragmentation of Africa as a shot on its own foot. Still nowadays, Africa incurs in such a cost to its economy because of the level of fragmentation. It's incredible how sometimes, in order to travel by flying from one country to the other, you have to go to Brussels, you have to go to Europe to return. It's a scandal. And the lack of investments in road infrastructure and so on. So the trade fragmentation, a great step has been done with the trade agreement. but it has to be implemented. In fact of the matter is that Africa, in order to benefit better from its potential, it should strive to integrate in terms of it's impressive how the barriers still prevail between small countries in Africa, between them. And also, of course, the issue of quality of governance, even though you have some fantastic examples of good governance that has paid off in terms of growth, you also have cases in which the bad governance has meant that natural resource wealth has become a curse. So let me highlight in this case, there is when we talk about Africa, you have to focus on. Now, trying to be short, I'm a bit cautiously pessimistic with respect to the ongoing times, with respect to the ability of those groupings of countries really to do better. We are not living the best of times in that regard. I don't have to tell you, now we have been watching the decline of foreign aid to African countries. And I'm not referring simply to the USAID that has been put out by Mr. Trump. Also, we have seen lower figures. If one looks at the figures collected by the OECD and ODA, you will note how the foreign aid has been declining. And there is an additional important aspect. Very often now tied the foreign aid transactionalized with other objectives. Mr. Trump is simply, let's say, the more crude of this transactional take on that. So seems things don't look. Africa will have to not rely so much in levels of aid as even we had in the past. And forget about the Chinese. Chinese don't give aid. They don't like aid, okay? They give loans at prices that are reasonably lower than market price, it's true, but it's lending. They want to be paid back. Chinese don't like this thing of debt forgiveness or much less foreign aid. You tell me a place where you see aid by China, okay? In the issue of debt, one of my departments at the bank was exactly the department that makes the debt sustainability analysis. The IMF, on the one side of the 19th Street, studies the debt sustainability of middle-income countries, and the World Bank, my department at the time, did the analysis of debt sustainability of low-income countries. And so the subject, I know, and I'm no longer there, of course, but my colleagues, my ex-colleagues, have been hammering on for several years now. It's no secret to anyone, that we have a series of countries that are over indebted in the sense that one cannot expect salvation by simply growing and so on, and they're trapped in a situation of unsustainable debt. In those circumstances, there is no other way but to do some debt restructuring and so on. And in this regard, again, China has an important responsibility. Why? Because the debt with the OECD, with the Club of Paris, had that relief in the beginning of the other decade, and the increase of debt by African countries, those who are facing such a type of difficulty, have come mainly from the market and China. And the G20, when proposed the framework for that sustainability discussion, it was to obeying a basic principle of anyone who has ever worked with the debt restructuring as I have, which is the following. You have to have all the creditors, or at least the substantial chunk of the creditors, at the table. Otherwise, there is no deal, because it's a game. It's a prisoner dilemma. You don't concede that relief because you were afraid that another one outsmarts you, does not give anything, and take his money back. So that's why there are principles like collective action. The bonds now, they come with collective action clauses, because that says, oh, if 75% of the creditors agree on a restructuring, that way the other ones are obliged. So, but as long as you have a majority, that is to say, you manage to succeed. That's why you have to have the creditors at the table. China prefers a bilateral way. And among other reasons, because it's able to negotiate other aspects as a precondition and so on. So on the debt side, there is this remaining challenge that some African countries are carrying a burden of debt that are not payable. And we have seen painfully over these last few years, just a couple of cases of a success in restructuring Ghana. Even so, it was a fight, and so on. So this issue of debt has to be prioritized in the relationship of countries in Africa, those who need, and G7, G20, and so on. On health and climate change, I'm coming to the end of my talk. Also, on climate change, obviously, the change of stance by the US will make a difference. It will make a difference with respect to climate change itself, because obviously the climate transition will be slower in the US than what it could be under the let's say, the ground of policies as those adopted by President Biden. But also because the attitude and the interest in financing and helping African countries in their climate energy transition and so on has changed. See, I can say this because for 22 years ago, and climate change became a dimension to be taken into account in each aspects of what we work at the World Bank, right? Even connection between gender equality and climate change. Well, I did work on this. Trade and climate change. And then comes Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury of Mr. Trump, and he last year started with all of my colleagues, all of us, concerned because the Heritage Foundation report said to be taken as potentially influential in Mr. Trump's administration, and it is in some areas, had even suggested President Trump to quit multilateral institutions. Well, and he has quit some 65 agencies, including the World Health Organization and several others and so on. But there was even the claim, the proposal that by the Heritage Foundation report that the United States should depart from World Bank and IMF and IDB and so on. So there was a sigh of relief in April of last year during the spring meetings when Scott Bessent came to the Institute of International Finance and said a word, instead of talking about leaving the U.S., leaving the World Bank, he mentioned, well, it does good things and so on, but, there was the but. It has mission creep. And then he refers to why not the World Bank financing nuclear energy? The message has been clear. And any of you, if you accompany the unfolding of the production and when I was there as an executive director, there were minimum percentages of the portfolio to be dedicated to climate change. Minimum. Now it's part of mission creep. And even, of course, under such a pressure, President Bunga has mentioned, well, why not the World Bank get engaged with nuclear energy and so on. But it's tough because you have a shrinkage. No one is talking about increasing the capital of the World Bank as it was taken. I was there when the last capital increase occurred, which was in 2018. And the space created by that capital increase was completely used during the pandemic, and it's exhausted. So there has been almost a consensus of the need to increase the capital of the World Bank. And the whole year was to have something like this over before the second half of the decade. It vanished. No one is talking about increasing an additional increase in the capital of the World Bank, and the mood is not favorable. By the same token, I finalize with this: the superb speech by Prime Minister Mark Carney 2 weeks ago in Davos expressed quite well. We are in a moment of rupture of the world order. And that's when he made a claim middle powers have to get together, try to defend themselves as much as they can. Because we're now in a world in which we have the big powers, and China has always been like this anyway, transactional on a bilateral basis. And of course, the multilateralism was and is exactly the denial of the bilateral. First thing that Mr. Trump did with his reciprocal tariffs was to detonate the most favored nation clause, which was and is a pillar of the trade negotiation system created with the WTO, with first the GATT, GATT, and then the WTO. First thing that he did was to break this down, reducing trade negotiations to bilateral transactions and involving not simply tariffs. It's not simply tariff. It's threat of tariffs or application of tariffs in order to obtain something else, which is definitely not a multilateral environment. So we are living through, we must recognize, in Africa has to, in my view, avoid being captured by any of these poles. It has to don't count much on aid. And when it comes to trade and production and integration and so on, Africa needs to make sure that multipolarity is maintained. Apart from the temptations that will come of the poles trying to grab the whole thing for themselves. Sorry, but I found important. After all, I lived through exactly what I spoke. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Octavio. That is very insightful, taking us back to history, bringing us back to the present, and the various developments across Ghana's space, say Africa's space, and we're really grateful for such revealing. So the fact that you mentioned some of them, you were actually there, it really tells us that indeed experience is much handy at this point in time. Thank you for sharing with us. We'll take some questions right now. Let me take one from says, this is anonymous attendee. He says, Prof, what accountability mechanisms could ensure that G7 and G20 pledges on climate and global health translate into measurable outcomes for Africa countries rather than remaining declaratory commitments? So this is from one anonymous. Again, please let's make the responses quite brief. So Octavio, would you like to take that for us?
See, the thing of counting on this is that it depends on the pledge made by the countries. It depends on the pledge that they make. Of course, a strong voice can be raised with respect to the voice of African countries, with respect to the allocation of those resources, with respect to the way that the commitments are drawn and so on, which is the broader agenda of increasing the voice of African countries and other non-rich areas of the world. The point is that ultimately, when it comes to aid or concessional finance, not only grants, but also concessional finance, it all hinges on the willingness by donor countries, as this jargon, to put money on the table. And in this regard, the maximum of hope that one may have is maintain as much as we can of what we had, right? And raise the voice.
Thank you very much, Tavio. Let me get Prof to also touch on. This is a question from Carl Ann Blackman. She's from Carl Ann from Grenada. He asked this question. He says, "Thank you for your presentation. As development is one of the key areas to focus for the G7, and as we know, the continent of Africa is wealthy with natural resources. What role can the G7 play in having the resources of the continent used to further develop the continent and contribute to the people of Africa?" So, Prof John?
I will want to say something on this later as well.
Very quickly. All right. Do you want to go ahead, Octavio?
Yeah. No, just to point out the following. It is not by chance that natural wealth can be either a blessing or a curse. We have examples. If you forgive me with due respect, comes to mind Botswana and Zimbabwe. Same natural resource wealth. Nonetheless, Botswana today has indicators of health and education and of fiscal health and so on that in some respects even better than Japan. You go to Zimbabwe, same natural wealth, and the results over the decades have been disastrous. The key word in this regard is governance, quality of governance. Governing is the key word. And the improvement of governance, let's be frank, depends. Nobody can do improvement of governance in a country but the country itself. It's a task that depends much on the effort by the inhabitants to improve the governance. There is no miracle in that regard.
Thank you very
All
much.
successful cases of rich countries, rich in natural resource, they all have in common some good aspects of governance.
Okay. Thank you very much, Octavio. I don't know whether John would like to say a very, very brief response to that as well. Then we'll wrap up the meeting today.
Sure, at the last G7 summit, that was kind of asked us, all of the leaders and their guests created a critical minerals alliance. So the G7 is already there. President Macron will invite many emerging powers to join the G7 leaders for his Evian summit. So they could and should, probably will take the next stage to developing a bigger, broader critical minerals alliance and one that could well certainly put environmental responsibility, ecological sustainability as a core part of the governing regime. But looking ahead, the question is, at the global level, the genuinely multilateral institutions, there's not one that's in charge of critical minerals, or really any minerals, or even energy, no World Energy Organization. So there is much work to do, I think, to not only reform, but to construct a new multilateralism. And I don't think Donald Trump's going to do it, but there's a hope that the British can lead it next year.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank you very
and there
much.
is, if I may, one meritful aspect on what John described, which is the
Very
following.
very briefly, Octavio.
Very briefly.
Okay.
Just the following. China has mapped out critical minerals and besides the rare earth that they have, and they involve not necessarily in production, but buying, purchasing, etc. They are in DRC. They have been buying cobalt in DRC. And they have concentrated the capacity of refinement, which is where the trick is. In some segments, China detains 90% of the world refinement capacity. And that's the tool that they played that forced Trump last year to ask for truce. Now, as of now, Mr. Trump has called Latin American countries for a meeting in Washington. And he's trying to make sure that, to the extent of possible, China is taken off to have access there. And he wants privilege. By the news yesterday, money coming from the development bank in the US and so on. The movement by Canada is meritful in the sense that it brings to discussion, instead of my individual country with them, to bring a more collective discussion. That's chapeau to Canada in that regard.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Octavio. Thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you very much, Prof. John. I'd like to call on Michelle, the Director of Research with Rewire to Build Africa, to give us a closing remark.
Thank you very much, Winston. I'm so elated to have everybody here. And I mean, the discussions were quite insightful. I must say I really learned a lot throughout the entire period of the webinar. And we want to give special thanks to our presenters who made time to come and enlighten us and give us more information on these critical partnerships for Africa. So I would like to also thank all the individuals who also joined, the participants, and all those who contributed questions. I mean, these are very important things that lead to the growth of Africa and then the world largely. So with that said, we are very grateful, and we'll keep you in touch. We have other webinars that we've planned out for the rest of the year. And when we are ready with concrete plans, would bring them. And also, we are also open up for a lot of collaborations. So if you have any collaborations that are in line with climate change and health issues, we are willing to collaborate with you. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Over to Winston.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Michelle,
you.
and for this amazing time. And also, I would like to especially thank our speakers who made insightful time from all over the world. From Rabat in Morocco, we want to say thank you to all our speakers who participated today. First of all, let me thank Professor John Curtin, the Professor of Emeritus of Political Science, University of Toronto. Dennis Maplausi, Health Equity Advocate and Patient Experience Leader, and Octavio Canuto, Senior Fellow, the Policy Center for New South. Thank you so much, our panelists. We appreciate that you made time to join us and give us and share your experiences and key deep research on this very topical and relevant issue. On behalf of Rewire to Build Africa, I say thank you so much. And also to all panelists or attendees from across the world, we want to say thank you. Expect more insightful webinars coming up for the rest of the year. We have so much packed for you. Thank you for making time and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.